last week on Legally Kidnapped.
Good evening. Our top story this week: a Wisconsin Republican state senator wants to make single parenting a risk factor for child abuse, ultimately opening the door for more investigations by CPS agents. In Oklahoma, a judge approves a settlement in a DHS child welfare lawsuit brought on by the child advocacy group Children's Rights. Colorado considers easing the rules on child abuse investigations 2 weeks after state officials announce a plan to reduce the number of kids who die after entering the child welfare system. And the state is also considering a ban on the use of dangerous prone restraint in DHS-run facilities. In Arizona this week, experts are saying that the best way to prevent child abuse and neglect is to help their families remain stable while the government cuts crucial programs that did so, thus putting the kids at risk of abuse or neglect. In Missouri, the legislature debates 5 bills aimed at making the child protective industry improve the way they handle things. In Illinois, the legislature passes a bill that would require the child protective industry to keep better records in regards to child deaths. And the Illinois House passes another bill that would require the child protective industry to keep brothers and sisters together in the same foster homes. The House in Indiana is backing a review of the child protective industry to review changes in how the state investigates reports of child abuse and neglect. And Governor Mitch Daniels fires back, sticking up for the child protective industry, calling recent media reports on the state's child protection failures unfair and in some cases even false. Nebraska's legislators are being urged to stop dwelling on the state's child welfare failures and look to the future instead. And in Massachusetts, the state with the highest number of families under investigation for child abuse, the legislature considers a bill to change the standard for child abuse investigations to require some evidence of abuse before sending out the CPS agents. In New Jersey, a CVS pharmacy screws up kids' fluoride treatments by accidentally replacing them with breast cancer medications. A school in Florida attempts to use the placebo effect by giving kids power bars and telling them that they will make them smarter in an attempt to improve test scores. A U.S. senator from Iowa sends a letter to Oregon asking what they're going to do about the overdrugging of children with psychiatric medications. Congressman Jim McDermott is complaining about the overuse of psychiatric drugs used by doctors and foster parents treating foster kids because the carers want the kids to be quiet. And now he's teaming up with Representatives Michelle Bachmann and Karen Bass to form the first foster care caucus, which is said to be committed to promote the welfare of all kids in the system without a clue as to what that would mean. Thousands of poor and disabled men stand to lose their only income next year because of a change in government policy that will allow states to seize every dollar of federal benefits from people who owe back child support, including taking their disability checks and veterans benefits. In California, the child protective industry is too cheap to buy Easter baskets for Montgomery County foster kids, so they're begging the public to do it for them. In Iowa, the state Senate passes a bill to give CPS agents an extra $6,500 a year to help them pay off their student loans. And in Maryland, a foster care agency appeals the state's decision not to renew their licensing contract. In Minnesota, Native American tribes are trying to get control of their adoptions of their own kids to parents who don't live on the reservations. In North Dakota, the child protective industry finds fault with Native American tribes' foster care system, probably gearing up for a takeover. In Rhode Island, adoptees may now acquire copies of their original birth certificate at the age of 25. The child protective industry in New York is hiding something by keeping their files in regards to the deaths of children secret, despite the law that requires them to be disclosed to the media. And an average of 5 students a day are arrested in New York City's public schools. A deported Mexican is trying to convince U.S. CPS agents not to put his boys up for adoption. The Children's Rights Ombudsman of Russia is calling for an all-out ban on U.S. adoptions of Russian orphans after a couple of parents abandoned a set of baby twins on the streets of St. Petersburg, Florida. In India, 42 kids are rescued from an orphanage following complaints of severe physical and sexual abuse. And the Indian government sends a special envoy to Norway to try to get a kid who was removed from their Indian parents out of the clutches of Norwegian CPS agents. In Canada, a Manitoba social workers union has decided not to appeal a court's ruling on the legalities of a public inquiry into the death of a little girl who died while in the care of the child protective industry. The British Columbian child protective cartel is blasted by a watchdog group for running a failure of a child protection service. The child's family is suing a pathologist in Alberta who performed an autopsy on their child who died for $2 million after he falsely ruled the death a homicide, thus plunging an innocent and grieving family into a 2-year nightmare. And the Alberta government is considering a law to prohibit Christian schools and homeschooling parents from teaching their kids that homosexuality is sinful. In Ontario, a report is urging the government to keep money flowing for foster kids until the age of 25. A set of twins who were adopted from China meet up for the first time after living 400 kilometers apart in 2 separate families. And the father who was wronged wrongfully arrested at his daughter's school after she drew a picture of a man holding a gun is getting no apologies from the school, social workers, or the cops involved, while the child protective industry fears that such a high-profile false accusation case will deter others from reporting kids who may or may not be at risk. In Australia this week, the public is mad at philosophers who argued in an article that killing newborns is morally the same as abortion and should be permissible if the mother wishes it. An Australian cell phone company is soaking kids for $1 a minute, up to $100 for calling the child helpline. And a parliamentary committee recommends that the government issue a formal apology to 150,000 Australian women who were forced to give up their newborn babies for adoption at birth right up through the 1970s. During the inquiry, a social worker admitted to how she was instructed to actively encourage young unmarried mothers to give up their babies at a hospital in Sydney. Some research is even suggesting the existence of a government-sponsored social cleansing plan, and the Uniting Church of Victoria in Tasmania finally comes to grips with their sins and says that they are sorry. In England, new figures are showing that half of the abuse accusations made against teachers turns out to be false. The watchdog group Ofsted issues tough new rules on adoption, saying that the child protective industry will only get an outstanding rating for adopting kids out within 12 months. And accusations of witchcraft are becoming more and more common in the child abuse cases amongst Africans in Pentecostal churches across the UK. A British foster molester is accused of sexual abuse after one of his accusers was originally accused of being a liar. A bishop is horrified by claims that parents are aborting babies because they're not the sexual gender that they wanted. And the Church of England says that they're sorry for abuse committed against children by members of its clergy. In entertainment news this week, Kelsey Grammer and his ex Camille settled their child custody case, agreeing to joint custody of both kids. And Disney removes an exhibit over criticism that it was offensive to overweight kids. In California this week, a father is arrested after chasing down a CPS agent who snatched his kids, ultimately leading to a high-speed chase from the police. In Connecticut, a CPS agent is charged with sexually assaulting a 19-year-old who is still in state care. In Illinois, a 12-year-old foster kid is charged with starting a series of fires over a 2-week period last Christmas. In Indiana, a mother drowned her 3-year-old son in the bathtub in order to prevent the father from getting custody. An ex-Oklahoma judge pleads guilty to fraud after she got caught collecting adoption subsidies for kids who she had passed off onto somebody else. In Ohio this week, a kid shoots up a school, and a former president of the Foster Parent Association and 2 other men get busted for sexual abuse and pimping out a kid who he adopted, with FBI investigation widening to see if it involved any more kids. A foster mother from Indiana is fighting the child protective industry to get desperately needed cancer treatments for her foster daughter. In Florida, CPS agents are trying to send a kid back to a home where he was afraid to go, according to his shrinks. The state of Iowa settles a lawsuit brought on behalf of a toddler who suffered brain damage from severe head injuries while in foster care. And in Maine, the Cumberland County District Attorney asked the court to throw out a lawsuit brought on by a dad who says that she interfered in his custody battle for his child. In Ohio this week, a boy who was removed from his parents for being obese was allowed to go back home after he dropped 50 pounds. In Oregon, the state agrees to pay $1.5 million to the estate of a little girl who was starved, beaten, and tortured in a failure to protect case. In Michigan, a state that ranks among the 10 worst states for kids living in high-poverty neighborhoods, the Court of Appeals ruled that 2 families cannot sue the state for failing to properly investigate abuse complaints before the 2 kids were killed. And finally, tonight in Pennsylvania, a lawyer who worked for the state as a guardian ad litem will not be paid for work that he did because he failed to attend a new required training program implemented by the state. For these stories and all the latest dirt on the child protective industry, visit www.legallykidnapped.com. And until next week, this is Baby LK, over and out.